Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. I'm really excited today that we have Dr. Clay Routledge here. He was at NDSU for 15 years. He was a Challey Institute scholar. We're going to talk about nostalgia today and how it can be a mechanism for progress, and I have some nostalgia for the time when Clay was here, actually. So Clay is the first person he's the one who started this series, so kind of the shoe is on the other foot. He used to be the one doing the introductions, and so really excited that Clay is here today and that he decided to come back here. So really excited about Clay being here. So Dr. Clay Routledge is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the Archbridge Institute, where he also leads the Institute's Human Flourishing Lab. He joined the Archbridge Institute in 2022, sadly after leaving NDSU, initially serving as Vice President of Research. Prior to joining the Archbridge Institute, he spent nearly 2 decades in academia as a professor of psychology, professor of management, and distinguished professor of business. As a thought leader in existential psychology and human motivation, Clay translates research into practical insights that help people reach their full potential, build meaningful lives, and advance human progress and flourishing. Building on his extensive scholarly research, teaching, and writing, Clay has authored dozens of articles for popular outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Newsweek, Fortune, Business Insider, The Hill, and Harvard Business Review. He also wrote the TEDx documentary short film, Why Do We Feel Nostalgia? His Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, CBS News, ABC News, BBC News, CNN Vox, National Geographic, Men's Health, Wired, Forbes, Oprah Daily, Shondaland, and many others. His work has been featured in them. He has appeared on numerous television and radio programs and podcasts such as NBC Today, Hidden Brain, Science Friday, Cheddar News, and NPR Morning Edition. He has also appeared in several documentary programs, including The Overview from NBC Peacock, The Benefits of Being Nostalgic from BBC Reel, Cursed Films from Shudder, and The Well from Big Think. So sorry about all of that stumbling, but Clay's been on a lot of different things. Clay regularly advises a range of organizations from small startups to large companies, helping them use existential psychology and behavioral science more broadly to improve their products, services, and workplace culture. He is co-editor of Profectus, a magazine dedicated to human progress and flourishing, and writes the weekly newsletter, Flourishing Friday. And I got a really good edition of it this morning talking about nostalgia and in the age of AI. It was very interesting. His latest book is Pass Forward, How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. So would everyone please welcome Dr. Clay Routledge.
Thanks everyone for coming. And I also have a lot of nostalgia for my time here. Maybe not so much for the winter, but that's the cool thing about how nostalgia works. We can pick and choose the features that we want to cherish. I do have a little bit of nostalgia for the winter here, actually. It's a pretty winter. So today I want to talk a little bit, before I start talking about nostalgia, I want to talk a little bit about why those of us who are interested in advancing human progress should think about psychology more. Part of it is because I'm a psychologist, so I'm biased. I think it's an important field. But when we think about progress, we tend to think about the ways that other forces outside of us improve our lives. So someone might say a key driver of progress is scientific discovery, technological innovation, medical advances. Those things are true. People in here who are from economics might focus on things like free markets or global trade and talk about how that advances human progress. Also true. Academia, so you're here in universities, people might say, well, it's these educational and scholarly institutions and some of the things behind them, whether it's free speech or the open exchange of ideas, that drives progress. Also true, and on and on. But all of these innovations have a common link, which is they come from human beings, right? Progress is powered by people. Every technological advance, innovation, discovery, all the public policies that people think are good come from people, right? And so when I talk about psychology as a way of thinking about progress, another way to think about this in your mind is we tend to think kind of top down. Oh, here's all these things that improve our lives. But if people are the things behind that, then you can also think about it as bottom up, right? We contribute to these institutions and these things, and then there's like a back and forth, right? And I think nostalgia is a great case study in how to think of that more bottom up way of thinking. And the other reason I think it's worth thinking about nostalgia is it'll illustrate that a lot of the times that we have an intuition or an assumption about something, it's not totally right. This is where you need empirical science to test these things. So to start, let's just think about what nostalgia is. I won't go into great detail into the history of nostalgia, but if you find this kind of stuff fascinating, it's a pretty wild history. So as long as we've had the written word, literature, there's been discussions in text about a sentimental feeling or longing for home and for the past. And so nostalgia is as ancient probably as the human condition. But it wasn't until 1688 that the term nostalgia was actually coined, and it was coined by a Swiss medical doctor. He's actually becoming a doctor working on his dissertation, his medical dissertation, and he coined the term nostalgia because what he had done is there were all these Swiss mercenaries that had come down from their alpine homes to fight wars in the plains of Europe that were experiencing all these ailments, including insomnia, disordered eating, fatigue, fever, all these problems, and at the same time they were singing songs and telling stories about their homeland. And so what this physician, his name was Johannes Hofer, said is, they're singing about home and talking about home is making them sick. So nostalgia is originally conceptualized as a medical disease, confined to the Swiss. They thought, this is something about coming down from the altitude of the mountains down into the plains of Europe. It's doing something to their brain. So it was very much viewed as like a brain disease, right? Now, some of his contemporaries liked it, but then they said, well, maybe it's some kind of demonic possession. Maybe it actually has something to do with the clanging of the cowbells in the Alps, and that causes damage to the middle ear, which in turn drives the sentiment from the brain to the heart. I mean, they had pretty wild speculations about what could be going on. The key being it's a medical disease. This idea persisted for some time, but then they figured out, well, it's not just the Swiss. Other Europeans can get nostalgic. In fact, even Americans can get nostalgic. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of documented diagnoses of nostalgia in the American Civil War for Union soldiers fighting in the South. I think all the way up until World War I, you can find evidence of nostalgia being diagnosed as a medical condition. But then what happened is the 1900s, you saw the rise of psychology and psychiatry, and you started to see nostalgia become less thought of as a medical disease and more as a psychological condition. Some kind of like depressive form of anxiety and a desire to maybe even return to the womb, a lack of maturity or something like that. And that persisted for a while. But then in the late 1900s, marketing researchers, consumer psychologists started to figure out that, wow, people will spend a lot of money on products and experiences that remind them of the past. And it seems to make them happy, right? And so that was when we started to think of nostalgia as like, there's something else going on here. And to be fair, there were other people, including Charles Darwin, throughout this history, who had noted that nostalgia doesn't seem to be really bad. It seems to be like a positive or warm feeling. But the dominant position in the medical and the psychological communities was that nostalgia was some kind of brain disease or mental illness. And that persisted well until into the 20th century. So I spend a lot of time in what you might call the progress movement in the think tank and academic world of people who are interested in what are the advances that make life better. And my experience has largely been that people in this space are anti-nostalgia. And the reason is they think of nostalgia as looking backwards, right? It's about reflecting on the past. But to drive progress, you need to look forward, right? In fact, it's a waste of time to get stuck in the past. And even the people that are somewhat sympathetic to nostalgia will say, well, it's lighthearted entertainment. But most people go further than that and they say, well, it actually might make you dissatisfied, because if you're constantly sentimentally looking to the past, that might make you look at the present and be like, oh, it's not as good today as it used to be. Or it might make you pessimistic about the future if you think our best years are behind us, for instance. There's also a view that nostalgia is sort of a dogmatic experience, because you're locking in on the way something was instead of being open to the way something could be, right? It reflects a lack of creativity. We see this a lot in the arts, right? There'll be a nostalgic movie and people will say, don't they have any new ideas? Why are we just repeating the old ideas, right? So you'll see that. Bottom line is a general view that I experience, at least in this space, is that nostalgia is a barrier to progress. Which is concerning, considering that nostalgia is everywhere, right? And so one of the things we do at the Human Flourishing Lab is national polling, right? And so we regularly field nationally representative surveys of 2,000 or so US adults and different backgrounds and demographic groups. And what we find in some of our surveys that we've fielded that involve nostalgia is like, most people report that they're nostalgic, and they're nostalgic a lot of the time. So that would be concerning if nostalgia is a barrier to progress. In addition to that, you don't just have to rely on people's self-reports, you can actually track consumer trends. And I've done a lot of consulting work in this space, and even I have been surprised at some of the trends that companies who, in the media space, have shown me that how popular old things are, like how popular old television shows are, or old movie. During the pandemic, for instance, Spotify, and they shared this data with everyone, found that not only were people listening to more music, which they had more time when they were locked down at home in the pandemic, but they were especially listening to older music more than they were newer music. So you can track a whole bunch of trends and see nostalgia is very popular. In addition to that, there's this growing interest in analog technology. And, you know, again, just another sign that nostalgia seems to be everywhere. So is all this nostalgia standing in the way of progress? I've met some of these individuals who'll say, like, yeah, we have all this progress, but imagine how much further will we be if it wasn't for the nostalgia, like, dragging us back and holding us backwards. So to really understand whether nostalgia is a barrier to progress or not, we need more careful scientific inquiry, because the history of nostalgia wasn't empirical. Even Hofer, who originally coined the term, he wasn't doing any kind of like sophisticated analysis. He was just observing the patients and the symptoms they were presenting, and he was seeing those symptoms co-occurred with them longing for home. And so what he assumed was that longing for home was making them miserable, right? So he assumed causation because he was observing, anecdotally at least, a correlation, but this wasn't a systematic investigation. So for the last 25 years or so, I've been fortunate to be part of an international group of researchers who have been studying the science of nostalgia. We've done a lot of different studies, and now there are a bunch of other people that I have no association with doing studies, so this field has really, really taken off. But this is a basic understanding of how we've kind of framed this inquiry. First, we started with, how do people actually experience nostalgia? Like, what is the content of the nostalgic experience? When people say they feel nostalgic for the past, what's going on in their minds? What are they doing? Second, what makes people nostalgic? What are the triggers of nostalgia? So when are we more or less likely to feel nostalgic? And then finally, when we do engage in nostalgia, what are the effects of that? What does that do for us? So we're going to kind of quickly go through each one of these questions. The first one being, what is the content of the nostalgic experience? And so this is an ongoing project that started with the simple activity of when we were wanting to understand, well, what are people doing when they feel nostalgic? And there was actually at the time, this was about 25 years ago, there was a periodical called Nostalgia, and people would send in essays, personal essays about their nostalgic memories. So we got a hold of several years editions of this, and so we got hundreds of these narratives, and we trained coders, we trained human coders to read these and to kind of rate them on different dimensions, to figure out what is there any sense of shared characteristics of the nostalgic experience. Now these are people's idiosyncratic memories, so they're going to be all distinct, but what's the commonality? Is there a commonality? So we started out with that pretty rudimentary analysis, and over the years it just got more sophisticated. We started soliciting narratives ourselves. We'd go around and collect nostalgic memories from people, either by having them write these memories or recording them and having coders do this. And then eventually we saw advances in natural language processing technology. So instead of having humans do this, we could have software programs code these narratives, which gives us a lot quicker responses. And then now with machine learning advances, you can really turn this over to transformer-based approaches, and they actually do quite good. It's kind of humbling, maybe some of you have had this experience, because we would build this code book, train humans to read all these essays and to code them, right? And this could take a whole semester or longer to code hundreds of these different essays. And then in the last couple of years, we've learned that you can actually just give those essays to ChatGPT, and it can do it in a couple minutes, and it'd be correlated over 0.9 with the human coders. So these are good advances for research. It allows us to collect a lot more data and do a lot more work. But what we've found in these analyses is there are some common characteristics for nostalgia, and this seems to be the case across age, across culture, across country. And what we find is when people talk about their nostalgic memory, when they share a nostalgic memory, they're sharing something that they find deeply meaningful in their life. It's their story. They're the protagonists. These are autobiographical memories. So the self is centrally featured in these stories. But critically, and not all, but most of these nostalgic narratives, other people are heavily featured. Nostalgic memories tend to be highly social, which makes sense because our most meaningful life experiences, we know from other research, tend to be the experiences we share with loved ones, right? There's another interesting emotional feature of nostalgia, which nostalgic memories tend to contain both positive and negative affect, but the positive affect is more prevalent than the negative affect. And in addition to that, most nostalgic narratives follow what we call a redemptive sequence, which to the extent that people do share negative emotions, they tend to be followed by positive emotions. So someone might say something like, I have this nostalgic memory for spending the summer with my grandmother. She's no longer alive, and that makes me sad. I miss her. But I'm so thankful for that time I had. It was one of the most meaningful memories in my life. So that redemptive arc is very characteristic of nostalgia, which might have something to do with when we're looking back over our life experiences. We have the ability to make sense of them and to extract the positive even out of perhaps difficult life experiences. And then finally, one of the things that we didn't originally predict, but we started to discover is a lot of nostalgic narratives surprisingly have a future-oriented bent to them. Like people will say things like, looking back on this memory makes me thankful and gives me hope for the future. Like I had this experience and it made me who I am. So maybe there will be more experiences going forward that I can pass down and share with others. And this inspires me. This gives me hope. So that was Again, in the early years, that was sort of a surprising finding, and an important one because it got us thinking about nostalgia as more than just a backward-looking sentiment. So the next question, what triggers nostalgia? So we've done hundreds, if not thousands, of experimental studies looking at this. And what we generally find is you can think of two classes of nostalgia triggers. The first one's very obvious. You've all experienced this, and this will come to mind quickly. There's a familiar smell, you see a commercial on TV, a song comes on, you run into an old friend. These are direct sensory inputs that are associated with certain memories from the past that immediately increase the salience of those memories, right? So those are the sensory inputs. This is what we rely on in marketing and advertising, right? Like we want to make someone nostalgic, we directly try to induce it with stimuli that we think will be associated with those memories. Music seems to be a particularly powerful one. And I think it has, I'm speculating here, but I think it has something to do with, we all sort of have a soundtrack to our lives. And so we can look back at different periods and there's that music, whatever the music is at that time, and music makes us happy, makes us feel human. And so there's something about music that seems especially powerful, but there's all sorts of different sensory inputs that trigger nostalgia. Where the story gets more interesting, I think, is when you think about the more internal psychological triggers of nostalgia. And those triggers seem to be more negative affective states. For instance, when we've done experiments in which we've induced different types of moods, like we've had people watch funny stuff and makes them happy and laugh. We've had them watch sad content videos, it sort of increases negative affect. We've had them watch kind of neutral stuff that doesn't seem to move their mood around that much. What we find is when people are watching sad content is when their scores on a subsequent questionnaire of nostalgia increase. Inducing positive emotion doesn't tend to increase nostalgia above baseline. Increasing negative affect does. Moreover, there seems to be some discrete negative affective states that are particularly likely to induce nostalgia. Perhaps the most pronounced one is loneliness. So nostalgia is a deeply social experience. So when people feel lonely or socially disconnected in some way, they tend to naturally bring to mind past experiences involving people, especially loved ones, that reminds them that there are people that care about them, that they have had social success in the past, right? And so people have looked at other negative affect inductions, and it seems like anything in life that brings us down, our brain wants to kind of be nostalgic and look for content from the past. And what for, right? What for? Well, that's when we start looking at the potential functions of nostalgia. So if negative affect makes us nostalgic, what happens when we actually engage in this nostalgia? Do we just ruminate? Does it make us feel worse, or does it do something else? And what we found in that research is that nostalgia actually increases the number of positive, affective, and well-being states. So nostalgia, even though it has negative emotions, it has this complexity, this bittersweet complexity in the experience, doesn't tend to actually elevate negative affect that much. It elevates positive affect way more than it does negative affect. It increases satisfaction with life. It increases a sense of belongingness. It increases self-esteem and self-confidence. Self-continuity, which is the sense that I have some connection to my past, a through line through my life, a life story. A sense of authenticity. I remember who I am, right? What I really care about, what my core characteristics are, and perceptions of meaning in life. Not in every study, but in many studies, belongingness is a key mediator. What I mean by that is nostalgia makes you feel socially connected, which is a big source of meaning in life, and that in turn has these downstream positive psychological effects. But it's not just affect. We've also discovered that nostalgia orients you towards a number of positive motivational states. So people feel more motivated to pursue important life goals after they feel nostalgic. They report feeling more inspired. Critically, nostalgia actually increases optimism for the future, not pessimism. So after people reflect on these important life experiences, they're like, oh, life can be full of rewarding, enriching, meaningful things. Maybe that will be the case going forward. Nostalgia brings online the social self, as I noted, and that seems to make people more empathetic towards others. And nostalgia also has this interesting effect in midlife, or starting in midlife, where it actually seems to make people feel younger. Young people tend to feel young because they are young, but there's something about, it depends on the study, it's somewhere between age 39 and 42, depending on the study. But somewhere in that space, when people engage in nostalgic reflection, it puts them in touch with their youth, and it seems to make them feel young at heart. And there's also been a number of experiments looking at nostalgia's effects on actual behavior. So if you have people engage in some type of creative problem-solving task, and then you have other independent judges rate their creativity, people who were first induced to feel nostalgic are more creative. There's been different attempts to use nostalgia as a way to orient people towards pro-social behavior, or to donate to causes. When they used nostalgia-oriented materials, people gave more money. It's not just that people help more when they're nostalgic. There's also some research that shows that people are actually willing to ask for more help. Again, it seems like nostalgia is bringing online the social self, which not only makes you more generous with your time, but makes you more willing to reach out to people when you're in need. Nostalgia just makes people want to socialize more, which is interesting because there's a characteristic of nostalgia as a kind of self-reflective or a ruminatory experience where you're sitting around thinking about the good old days. When in reality, what happens is when people think about the good old days, they're like, oh, I want to have some good times now. And they tend to reach out to people and use that as inspiration for social connection. And there's also been some pretty cool work using Fitbit trackers and things like that, and seeing how when people listen to have nostalgic playlists, they seem to exercise more and they get out and do more things. Again, part of that might be nostalgia makes you feel more youthful, but in general, we know positive affect, meaning in life, those things that nostalgia does are also predictors of physical activity. So based on all this research, my colleagues and I have proposed a self-regulatory model of nostalgia, where what seems to be going on is when you're going through something in life that's difficult, or you feel uncertain, or you're dissatisfied in some way, humans are resilient. We want to resolve that. We don't just want to be well, I guess that's it, things are bad. We look for solutions, right? Where do we get solutions? Well, we reach into the past where we have a bank of meaningful memories, and we pull for them from experiences that remind us of things like, oh, maybe I moved to this new city and I'm lonely and I don't know anyone, but I've made friends in the past, so I can make friends again. I'm having to learn something new at work, and I feel, I feel old, and I don't know if I can do this, keep up with this. Well, in the past, I had to do new things, and I had to take risks, learn new skills. Maybe I can do that again, and so forth. So nostalgia seems to be a self-regulatory tool that we naturally use when we're going through a difficult time, and it pushes us forward. So just as a review, if you remember what I said before about what nostalgic critics tend to think, that it's just entertainment, it makes us dissatisfied with the present and pessimistic about the future. Maybe it makes us dogmatic, it's a lack of creativity, it's a barrier to progress. Well, what the science shows is quite the opposite. It's much more than lighthearted entertainment. It certainly can be that. We all enjoy nostalgic media, but at the same time, it seems to be doing something much deeper for us. It actually increases satisfaction with the present. It makes us thankful for what we have. It makes us more optimistic about the future because it allows us to pull from positive elements of the past that we can use as empirical evidence of oh, even if things look bad, there's reasons to think that things can be good. It makes us more open-minded. It brings the social and pro-social self online. And it actually can support creativity. It doesn't have to be a barrier to creativity. In other words, I see nostalgia as a critical driver, not a barrier to human progress. So that's what the research shows. I told you what the nostalgia critics think. what do actual everyday Americans think? So again, as I mentioned before, at Archbridge, we do a lot of public polling. So we just did a national survey where it's like, well, let's just ask Americans their views on nostalgia. Are they closer to the critics or are they closer to the research? Well, the general public is closer to the research. They seem to understand inherently the power of nostalgia. So 84% of Americans think nostalgia is a reminder of what's important in their life, we find. 77% see nostalgia as a source of comfort when life is difficult or uncertain. And 72% report that their nostalgic memories are a source of inspiration when life is uncertain or difficult. So the vast majority of Americans seem to understand nostalgia as a positive resource in their life, not a liability. So more recently, we've been getting into the idea of nostalgia, not just in the autobiographical sense, but this broader experience, cultural experience of nostalgia. I actually had this idea when I was working on my book because I was interviewing somebody and they said something I hadn't really thought about before. This individual said that he was like all in on Christmas, and he decorated his house with all the lights, like in Christmas Vacation, was like really obnoxious about it. And I remember thinking, oh, this guy must have a lot of nostalgic memories for Christmas from his childhood. And he told me, actually, my Christmases as a child were not good. My family life wasn't good. I had an abusive father, a dysfunctional family. Christmas was not a good time for us. But I knew Christmas was supposed to be a good time. And I could see other people having these positive Christmas experiences. And as I built my life and started my family, I wanted to build those kinds of positive Christmas nostalgic memories. And so he was borrowing other people's nostalgia from the broader culture as a way to build memories for his family. And so that got me thinking about the idea that, well, sometimes our own memories might not be enough, and we might want to pull from a broader set of nostalgic experiences. In other words, you can think of humans as cultural organisms that share experiences and stories and beliefs and traditions that transcend time and space. Some of these connect to our personal memories. A lot of times our individual autobiographical memories are situated within a broader cultural context, right? And this is how we have a lot of collective experiences. Like you and I might have been to the same concert 10 years ago and each have our own individual nostalgic memory about it. But then we talk about it and we're like, oh, what's your memory? What's our memory? We share this broader memory of an experience we've had with other people. So nostalgia can take on these kind of collective forms. And also, interestingly, nostalgia can take on a more historical form that we've started to discover, which is people actually report feeling nostalgic for times before they were alive. So they can't possibly have their own autobiographical memories because their nostalgia is for a time that predates them. And that's when we started to get interested in the idea of historical nostalgia. And we've done this isn't just a Gen Z phenomenon, but I want to talk about Gen Z in particular because I think it's a good example of not just the psychology of progress, but in how there's often more to the story than we often hear. And what I mean by that is, what's the story we hear about Gen Z over and over right now? They're mentally, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're lonely, they're addicted to technology. You hear all these negative, they're having a hard time being good workers, they're adulting, they had helicopter parents, all these negative stories about Gen Z. And I'm thinking, that's it, that's the story, right? Like there seems to be, I see a lot of young people doing awesome things, living fulfilling lives and being creative and industrious. And so there's another side of the story of Gen Z which often doesn't get the attention in our negative media climate, in which the focus tends to be on what's going wrong with young people these days. And I think their nostalgia is actually an interesting case study of that. So on the one hand, and this also comes from our research at the Archbridge Institute, on the one hand, Gen Z is very positive about technology. Young people tend to be into new ideas and early adopters of new innovations, right? And so you hear these negative stories about Gen Z and their addiction to social media, Yet we find that 77% of Gen Z adults say that they feel like they're part of a community when they're online. They actually get some positive social experiences online. And 77% also say they're not addicted, they're not addicted to these technologies, they're in control. They can decide when and how to use these technologies, right? However, at the same time, Gen Z reports that they do have concerns. They love the technology, but they also worry that it has potential negative effects for their mental health. They're worried about its impact on our polarization, and they think it might drive people apart more than it brings them together. And so you see an ambivalent relationship with technology among young adults today, where they want the benefits of tech, they like it, they're open-minded, they're interested, but they have concerns. Might nostalgia be helping them address these concerns? So we also did a national survey of people's experience with historical nostalgia, which we defined to them as feeling nostalgic for a time before you were alive. Right, so these aren't your own autobiographical memories. These are nostalgic feelings towards something that came before you. And what we found is Gen Z is very historically nostalgic. So 68% of Gen Z said they are nostalgic for a time before them. 73% said they're drawn to media styles, hobbies, or traditions from these historical periods. 78% think when there is new technological innovation, it should incorporate these kind of historical designs. 65% say that historical nostalgia helps them when they're stressed about modern life. And 66% report that historical nostalgia helps them when they're anxious about the future. So it's not just that. When you look at some of these consumer trends that you might assume, as I did, are driven by Gen Xers like me and older, people who grew up in the analog age, like vinyl records, CDs, you might think, well, that's my generation. We had that stuff when we were young and we're buying it. Well, Gen Z is actually a major driver of these trends. Gen Z are the ones buying vinyl records. Older people are buying this stuff too, but Gen Z is buying them almost more than anyone. Gen Z is the main driver of the increase in physical book sales. Remember when Amazon was the death of the independent bookstore, brick and mortar bookstore? Now there's more. Now those are growing. Like there's more and more openings of independent bookstores than there has been in decades. Gen Z likes going to bookstores, like interacting with real people and talking to them, getting recommendations, going to book clubs. There's you've probably all heard of the dumb phone phenomenon, right? A lot of young people are buying. They're like, I still need a phone to get in touch with people, but I would like not to be distracted by these apps all the time. We've also seen some of the largest growth in live entertainment in a long time. Music festivals, concerts, driven a lot by young people. All sorts of crafting is increasing. Again, people of all ages are doing this, but Gen Z seems particularly interested in crafts. So we partnered with a firm out of London called Discover AI, and we are interested in these trends, and we have these I showed you our data, like our survey data, but we are interested in getting a more qualitative picture here. So we partnered with Discover AI, and they have a bespoke AI tool that goes online where young people are on discussion boards or on comments and media outlets and kind of looks at what the conversation, in other words, we're just listening in on what young people are saying so we can kind of get more organic data as opposed to us asking them targeted questions. And what we use with this AI tools to try to figure out, well, what are they talking about? When they're talking about historical nostalgia themes, when they're talking about their interest in retro tech, in retro styles and aesthetics, in retro media, what are they talking about? And what we find is, well, I'm generalizing here, but I think this is a good, like the take-home message is two things, I think: control and community. What we tend to find is young people are saying, I want to be in control. I want to use my agency to be in control of this experience. And so what if Netflix takes down the movie I like? Well, if I have a physical copy of it, then it's mine, right? I don't like feeling like I'm being pushed around by algorithms. Well, if I can decide how to use this technology, so there's that sense of agency and control, and also a growing appreciation for as wonderful as online communities can be, and they're a great way to meet people and connect with people, especially that live far away, there's something missing when we don't have in-person activities, and we're seeing a shift in priority towards that among younger consumers. So, nostalgia does all these good things for us, it seems, but can it be a barrier to progress and flourishing? So there's also been some research highlighting the potential negative side of nostalgia, particularly what we would call collective nostalgia or group-based nostalgia. So in general, if you have a nostalgic memory or experience, or you feel nostalgic towards a particular group that you're part of, that elevates your likelihood of engaging in group bias, which makes sense. You're like, I have these positive feelings towards this group. If I have the opportunity to favor this group over another group, I'm going to. That's not inherently bad. When your football team plays another team, you want them to be in-group biased, right? You want them not to help the other team, you want them to help their own team, right? To feel a sense of loyalty and duty to the in-group. So and we want this in our organizations, we want this in our nation, so there's a lot of times in which in-group bias helps bring individuals together around a shared goal or purpose, right? So that's good. But of course, in-group bias can be bad when it interacts with other variables that lead to hostility towards outgroups or prejudice or discrimination against other groups. And so nostalgia can be leveraged in that direction. At the same time, there's been some interesting research that I really think highlights the value of a pluralist, diverse society, which is if you have nostalgic memories involving members of other groups, that tends to make you more empathetic and tolerant of members of other groups, because you're like, oh, we share this meaningful memory together, and that helps humanize the outgroup. So nostalgia can be used in a way that actually it decreases hostility towards outgroups if there's memories that involve members of that group. And then there's been some interesting research on the way nostalgic narratives are shared, the nostalgic messaging, right? So in this research, what they found is if you take a nationalistic type of nostalgia, and the message is about how our society is diverse and open, you tell the immigrant story, you talk about all the different people that came to our country and that helped made it a dynamic, successful nation, that kind of nostalgia actually makes people more open-minded and tolerant of different others. If you tell a story that's more of a closed, homogenous nostalgic story, they've done some of this research, not just in the US, but in the Netherlands. And if you tell us a nostalgic messaging about how, oh, the Netherlands used to be this way before we had these immigrants and we had this like harmonious society, that tends to decrease tolerance for outgroups and for immigration. And so the messaging matters, the stories we choose to tell, the aspects of the past we choose to focus on and feature play an important role in whether or not nostalgia is good or bad for societal functioning and dynamism. So if you're an advocate for progress, my take-home message to you would be to encourage you not to dismiss or reject or avoid nostalgia, but lean into the fact that it's a natural part of the human condition. People tend to become nostalgic when they're going through something difficult, when society's changing, when there's a lot of disruption in their lives, and they're looking to feel rooted, they're looking for guidance, they're looking for inspiration. That's part of being human, and it has a number of positive effects. And the best way to channel it towards productive, progress-oriented ends isn't to avoid it and to say it's bad for us, but to help use it in a way that we find the most likely to promote progress and flourishing. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, I'll just ask the first question, and I'll just remind you if you could just repeat very briefly the questions, because the Zoom people won't hear the question.
Okay.
But I I just want to ask you, so a lot of the, my understanding is that nostalgia, a lot of the time it's involuntary, so you don't consciously think like, I'm going to draw on this memory. But I know that, I mean, if that's accurate, I know that you also have helped businesses. Could you just talk a little bit about some intentional ways that you've helped businesses to draw on nostalgia to help them be more successful?
Yeah. So the question was, a lot of the times nostalgia might be involuntary, like we just naturally do it. But also I've worked with a number of organizations and companies, businesses, to use nostalgia more intentionally and how we do that. So one of the things that businesses think about, one of the things I've done with businesses is helping them understand the natural part of nostalgia. So I've actually worked with a large streaming service company, and they were surprised about how much audiences liked their heritage content, like the old content, their old IP, right? They're introducing all these new shows, but people, even young people, are watching the older shows. So part of that consulting is just helping them understand why young people would want to engage in that content anyway and what they're getting out of it. But then in terms of actually helping them utilize nostalgia more, it's really helping people see it beyond that lighthearted entertainment. So for instance, one organization I've worked with is in the business of brand legacy and brand management. And what they've found in their internal research is that young workers are very interested in their company's heritage, in their company's story. And there's this stereotype that young people they've got their whole lives ahead of them. Why would they be looking backwards? And so a lot of times businesses, don't spend a lot of energy connecting their younger employees to the history of the organization. But if they did so, they would see that that's one of the things that increases organizational commitment and reduces turnover intentions was because it helps young people embed their story within a broader story. They want to know where their organization came from. A more specific point about that is an intuition of a lot of businesses is to shy away from the negative aspects of their history. So if your company has a history of racism, for instance, people, you don't really want to revisit that. But what they don't appreciate is so much of not just nostalgia, but in general, human interest in stories is an interest in redemption and in redemptive arcs. Like people like that. So if your organization can say, yeah, we have this dark part of our history, but we overcame it, that's an example of progress that young people like to hear about, right? They're like, oh, so if we think there's a problem now, and you're saying that you had problems before and you resolved them and you came out better, then that's inspirational for us. So that redemptive arc, like I said, we have this tendency to not want to talk about that stuff because we're embarrassed. The company might be embarrassed if it's past, but overcoming it is very useful, particularly for young employees. And this, John, because I remember we used to talk about this all the time. There's so much negative media that makes people feel like, oh, things are really bad, society's going downhill. But these stories of past progress, we found in our own surveys at Archbridge as well, when people can experience things that we've done in the past that have made life better, that doesn't make them feel like, oh, I guess the good times are behind us. It reminds them that life can continue to get better, and it increases gratitude for progress. So that's one thing that I've worked with businesses on, is like helping them realize that their intuitions about nostalgia are often wrong, and that it's actually a tool that can bring a lot of workers together. I think especially in this era of remote work, a lot of times workers are looking for ways to have some kind of common in-group, some kind of connection to their organization, and that nostalgic story and helping them be part of it is very useful in that regard, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, interesting conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to hear your opinion about nostalgia and how it intersects reality. So if you have, I remember personally, I used to remember what do I have nostalgia for when my life was perfect and I was with my parents. And now that I have reality, I tend to, when I think about that previous life, that was just a curated life, that wasn't reality. And it gives me this peace that I feel like is a false bliss, because that aspect, that reality doesn't translate to today's reality. So it kind of gives me this false peace that everything is going to be fine, instead of getting the skills or getting the mental ability to be able to tackle what the real reality is. So nostalgia, for most of us that are just looking at this, I feel like most of us that in that in a bubble where we have our reality that we have not starting from are so curated by our parents, and it doesn't really translate to how we should be able to have this how we should be able to translate it to how reality is. So I just wanted to get your opinion on.
Yeah. Okay. So I had a hard time hearing you, so I'm gonna try to repeat the basic idea of the question. So I think her question was, a lot of these nostalgic memories are from like a curated past, and in present reality, how do we connect these kind of biased, perhaps, like feelings towards the past with like dealing with the present reality? Well, one of the things that we've found, or I guess connects to a broader literature on what we call sense making, is that the more time we have from an experience or set of experiences, the more time we have to draw the lessons out of it, and to think about ways to make it useful in our lives. And so you might have, as an example, maybe you have some holiday memories that you're like, oh, I love the holidays, and they were great. We had all these times together. And in reality, there was a lot of stress. There was fighting. There's things going on. And we tend to forget that stuff, and we just remember the positive. So one view of that would be like, well, when we're dealing with life in the present and all the challenges, like, what is that sort of biased opinion what kind of purchase are we gonna get from that when we're dealing with a complex reality, since it seems to be like a rose-tinted glasses kind of effect? Well, what we've found in the research is because of that sense-making process, what people are doing is that people don't need like reminded of, how somebody fought with somebody or this problem happened. What they need is an ideal to strive for. And in goal making, what we do is we do idolize things, not because we're trying to build utopia or we expect everything's going to be perfect, but we need that kind of inspiration to try to improve things. And so it just happens to be part of the human condition that we're naturally dissatisfied. It's an annoying part of the human condition because we're never, we're always like, things could be a little bit better. But the same thing that seems to make us miserable by never being satisfied is also the driver of progress. But in order to move towards progress and not just get stuck with like, well, I guess things aren't the way we are, we do need idealized states and sources of inspiration. Just like, so another way of thinking about it, if they made a movie of your life, it would be pretty boring, right? Because it would just be a lot of mundane experiences. If you go to a movie and you see something like that, you wouldn't find it enjoyable. What we like about movies is they're edited. They take the highlights, they tell a story. And we seem to be doing that with our own autobiographical story. We're not pulling from every mundane memory. We're pulling here and there from the things that seem to be useful affectively, inspirationally. This isn't necessarily like a totally rational process, of course. We're not just playing back the tape of life. And what we're doing is we're looking for a more motivational state. So even when we're living in the present reality and it seems like we're dealing with complex challenges, the sort of sentimental, idealized states can actually be quite inspirational, I think. I hope that kind of answered your question. Yeah.
Are you using AI or other tools to like help people translate their memories into a replay to like induce a certain experience or behavior?
Yeah, the question was, are we using AI as a way to help people translate their memories into experience? We haven't done that yet. I think that's a cool possibility. One thing, this isn't exactly what you're saying, but one thing I saw the other day, which was, I'm not sure what to make of it. It was interesting, but young people are using AI to make nostalgic videos of like the 80s and the 90s before they were alive. And what's really weird about these videos, you can find them online, is, so these aren't their personal memories. These are just kind of like, oh, here's what life was like in the 80s. Is in these videos, the characters are talking to the present day people saying, hey, I hear you're on your phones all the time and you're doing this and that. Like, we used to ride our bikes and go, and skateboards and hang out and in person and do all these things. And these videos are being made by young people, to young people, using AI. To tell people to not be so plugged in. So it's a very strange thing. But I don't know if in terms of like research, I know people are using VR as a nostalgia induction. And so I do know that kind of work's going on, which I think would be pretty powerful because it would help with that more multisensory experience. But yeah, we haven't done that so far. What we've largely used AI for is more to just like curate and make sense of the volumes of text from people's shared narratives. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Routledge. You are an excellent presenter.
Thank you.
My question is very simple. What inspired you to choose nostalgia as a topic?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for asking that, because I love talking about that. Like, I actually was not that interested in nostalgia. When I started graduate school, I was interested in people's ability, the uniquely human ability to think about the future, positive and negative. So by being a species that has the capacity for mental time travel, we can imagine all sorts of possibilities, which is, a big driver of progress, right? We can dream, we can imagine. But nothing good comes for free. And so the downside of that capacity to think about the future is all the anxiety inherent in being able to think about the future. The future is unknown. The one thing we do know is not great, which is our mortality. And so my original interest was in how the capacity to think about the future, while it's important for making us a goal-driven species, also creates a lot of potential for anxiety. So as a psychologist, I was interested in that future-oriented anxiety. And then what we started to discover is that same capacity to mentally time travel to the future, you can also use to time travel to the past. And it turns out that, and this was some of our first empirical studies, when people are anxious about the future, they naturally use the past as a way to mitigate that anxiety. And so that's when we first started thinking about, this time machine component of the future is scary, it's unknown, the past can help guide us towards it. And so originally my interest was, it's kind of funny, I've come full circle, because originally I was like, I'm interested in the future, and maybe the past is sort of a nostalgia is a defense mechanism that at the time I just thought all it does is make us less anxious. So it works as a psychological defense, which is important. And then over many years of doing this research, we're like, actually it's more than that. Nostalgia itself seems to push people towards the future. It has a more like growth-oriented motivational characteristic than we originally thought. So, but that's what's kind of cool about scholarly and scientific inquiry, right? You might start down one path and think one thing, and then you sort of, that leads you down this other, and then you follow in, and then 25 years later, you're like, I'm still talking about nostalgia. Yeah.
Building on what you just said, do you have any concerns about the weaponization of cultural nostalgia? As a Gen Xer who lived through the 80s,
Yeah.
I'd like to be able to laugh at the fact that we're just remembering happy days and
Yeah, yeah.
the Cosby Show before we knew the background. Can you speak to that? Because I feel like it's happening a lot.
Yeah. So yes, I am worried about the weaponization of nostalgia. But my response to that, I guess, is, to me, that doesn't mean and I'm not suggesting you're saying this by any means, but a lot of people, they're like, they highlight ways in which charismatic leaders or authoritarian regimes use nostalgia as sort of in that kind of way. And that's true, and you can find it, you can find it on all, so when I was working on this book, it was kind of interesting because you could see all these examples of nostalgia all over the political spectrum. So for instance, there's some qualitative research on Russians who are nostalgic about the Soviet Union. They're not saying, oh, I want to go back to a time of authoritarianism when people had no freedom or anything, but what that's tapping into is there's something they're saying that they don't like about society today, and for some reason they're looking back and saying, well, there's something about that time that is comforting or stabilizing. So I'm like, well, you don't want to, we don't want to go back to that. Just like you might see people say, oh, in America there's something about the 1950s, or you hear this nostalgia for the way things used to be, and you want to say, well, it wasn't great for everyone. And so it's not that people want to go back to that time. When you dig it a little bit deeper, oftentimes what you find is they're just trying to make sense of the present time, and they're looking for some comfort and some inspiration to go forward. And so that's where I think what's important is to not respond to bad nostalgia by saying we should do no nostalgia. We should respond by recognizing that nostalgia is an inherent part of the human condition, and people naturally gravitate it when they're dissatisfied or stressed or anxious. And so the best thing we can do is to help people use nostalgia in a constructive way. So to me, if somebody says, oh, life used to be better, my response is, well, no, you can use nostalgia to say there are ideas from the past that maybe would be useful. But if you start getting into that black and white thinking of, oh, things used to be better, then I think that's a good time to say, well, use nostalgia more constructively. And another way of saying it is, nostalgia is not the only variable. Nostalgia should be integrated into other things. Like, it's not the only game in town. So nostalgia can help be useful for advancing progress, but you need these other elements. But people are just, it just happens. Like when during the pandemic, nostalgia went way up. Everyone was anxious and lonely, and you saw cultural nostalgia go up. So any time where there's major societal disruptions or individual life circumstances that are disruptive, people naturally turn to nostalgia. So the challenge is, how do we help them use nostalgia as constructively, get the benefits out of nostalgia without the negatives, I think. That was a great question, thank you.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'm sure Clay will be willing to answer more questions that people have outside there. And so let's thank him again for a great